Were you successful? Let's try it together. So to implement this, I'll start by copying that div here and adding it again, where I now want your email, and this is for an input with ID, email, and also type email, which will actually give us some default browser validation already, but we're still also going to add our own one to validate on every keystroke and so on. And then here for that text, I will say, please enter a valid email. So now we have that second field. But of course, it's still connected to all those name handlers. So that's the next step. Let's add state. The entered email state with the set entered email state updating function for the value. And then also a second state for the touched status of this input. So entered email touched and set entered email touched. And that initially is false. Now we'll need those handlers here. So I'll add an email input change handler, get my event here, and then in there I'll just set entered email to event target value. And I'll add a blur handler as well. It's the email input blur handler, which of course is very similar to the other blur handler, where I set entered email touched equal to, and not equal to something, but instead to true like this. And then we can connect these two handler functions here on the email input. For on change, I connect this to the email input change handler. And for on blur, we connect this to the email input blur handler. And we pass the entered email back into this input as a value. Then with this in the form submission handler, I of course also want to reset that. So I'll set the entered email to an empty string to reset that value, and set entered email touched here to false to reset that. And now we of course also want to infer the validity and find out whether we want to show an error or not. And for this, I'll add a new constant, entered email is valid. And here I'll then check if entered email, that value, if that, let's say, includes a @ symbol to keep things simple. You could also do some regex validation here, but I'll just have a simple check here where I say if it has a @ symbol, it's valid. And of course, I'm aware that this is not entirely correct, but this here is really mainly about the React code and the React logic. And then we can add a entered email is invalid constant, where we check if it's not valid. So where we check this constant here, and combine that with checking whether it was touched. So entered email touched, just as we did it up there. And then we can use entered email is invalid down there to derive the classes and set up our email input classes by using entered email is invalid, and then setting this to form-control invalid, and setting it to just form-control otherwise. And we use entered email is invalid to also potentially show this error message. We also want to take it into account for the overall form validity. So for that here, I want to check if entered name is valid and entered email is valid. Only if both are valid, the overall form is treated as valid. And if I now save this and go back, this is our form. And I can click into my name to see the warning here. And my email is then also highlighted. But that's just because I messed something up here. My email input classes, the constant I prepared a couple of seconds ago, I should also be using that on that div which wraps my email. So that was the mistake here. With that, that's not marked as wrong anymore unless I click in there without entering something valid. Now I can enter valid things here, but only if both are valid, the form becomes submittable. As soon as at least one of them is invalid, the form is not submittable anymore, and we have to enter valid values into both to submit this form, clear it, and then also print our results. We're not printing the email address, but we are printing the name here. And now we applied what we learned, and we're doing this on a second input as well. But you might be able to spot some code duplication here. So let's tackle that next.